On today's show, the Bucks are still searching for a head coach, and they are searching far and wide. Every hour, there is a new candidate on the list, and I get the sense that Bucks fans are starting to get a little bit restless. We've heard from different candidates and experts from across the NBA, but now it's time to bring Frank Madden on and see what do we make of what the Bucks are doing with this head coaching search. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
On Bucks, my name's Kane. You can see and hear me on this show Monday to Friday, and also from my work over at ESPN. Today's episode is brought to you by the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And I did go to a Colorado Rockies game tonight, and I used the Game Time app, and I was able to get a ticket for about $4. And I don't think the Rockies are doing too well. They beat the Cincinnati Reds. So cop that, Cincinnati. You lost to the Rockies. That's embarrassing. And alongside me, though, the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden. It's been a while since we podcasted, Frank, and there's a pretty – look, sometimes I like to get stuck into you, and if you don't want to podcast with me, I understand it. You've had enough of me. We do a lot of talking during the regular season, but this time was a pretty legitimate reason. You brought another young human into the world. Emma Louise, how has life been the last week for you, Frank? Well, he's obviously hasn't podcasted for a while because he's still on mute. I tell you what, this is a really rough start. This is a rough start.
Yeah, if people may have noticed, literally during the intro to the podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube, literally my daughter right now is 5 feet from me, more or less sleeping. You know, with these newborns, you kind of get in these like 3-hour shifts of like feeding, and then they kind of do a lot of sleeping and whatever. And so Kane caught me timing wise. It's 11:30 Central Time when we started. Kane caught me right at the start of a feeding window, and so Kane and I talked as I changed the diaper, fed this child, burped her, got her down, and she's laying in this bassinet. Our ability to have a smooth podcast is entirely correlated with her pacifier staying in her mouth. So I jumped out as the intro was coming because I heard her making noise and her pacifier had fallen out of her mouth. It's nice when I can get her down without using the pacifier, but for the purposes of podcasting, I was like, all right, I'm just going to put that pacifier in because that usually kind of keeps her calm. So if I jump up and go over to my right, it's going to be to check on a pacifier being in this baby's mouth. But yeah, I am fortunately on paternity leave right now, so that's very convenient from a work perspective. But yeah, kids just sort of upend your existence, and we have not been getting a whole lot of sleep. This second child seems to be not as good a sleeper as Tilly, my first one. So we'll see if that continues. But but anyway, yes, our weird times being a podcasting parent. But I'm sure many of you guys can relate. So we'll get through this as well as we can. And if I have to throw the headset down and dash over to make a quick pacifier check, that's why.
No, I'm sure we'll get through this easily enough. And as always, we thank everyone for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or first listen of every single weekday. Even in strange times like this, I'm in a hotel room. I wasn't sure about my audio with the podcast we did yesterday. So now I'm holding this little mic that I've got. So everything's just a little bit weird at the moment. I'm not sure about my hotel Wi-Fi either, but we are going to push through, and we appreciate everyone for their support. Subscribe, drop a like, comment, all those things. And there is plenty of opinions going around about the next head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. And you did the hard work here. Even though you've got lots of things going on, Frank, I wanted to get you on to see, or to gauge your temperature on where we're at. And I'm seeing a lot of frustration from Bucks fans about just how many names are on the list right now. And you've done the hard work here. Mid-feed, you have sent through some names to the chat. So I'm just going to read them through, and then I'm going to throw it straight to you. So here are the names that the Bucks have reportedly been confirmed as having a conversation with. So Adrian Griffin, Kevin Young, Chris Quinn, Charles Lee, Monty Williams, Scott Brooks, Mark Jackson, James Borrego, Kenny Atkinson, and then some of the other names that have perhaps more loosely been discussed, or certainly we have discussed on this podcast. Nick Nurse, Ty Lue, Steve Nash, apologies, I know we'll get some comments, Frank Vogel, and Doc Rivers. So, Frank, we actually haven't spoke about, we have off the podcast, but we haven't spoke about this on the podcast. So how have you taken in the pursuit over the last week and really the constant updates of who the Bucks are going to talk to?
Yeah, I mean, my general view of this is, there's no harm in casting a wide net. I think part of that is dictated by the fact that the Bucks have what I would believe is an attractive job. Obviously, some of that is dictated also by how much the Bucks are willing to pay, and we're assuming that the Bucks are going to be paying, market rates for these guys, and that a team like Toronto or now Phoenix is not going to come in and pay significantly more than the Bucks, right? Obviously, Mike Budenholzer was owed $8 million a year the next 2 years, so that's towards certainly the higher end of what guys get paid. I believe Monty Williams had 3 years, $21 million left, and you'd expect the ballpark as far as annual salary goes. So I would say this, like, I try not to really overreact to names that get thrown out, because on the one hand, I think you'd say, sure, cast a wide net, ask as many people as who might reasonably have something interesting to say, like, have a chat, figure out what people think of how they would change this team, what they think should stay the same, how they would approach things like the Bucks half-court offense problems, right? How they would think about the Bucks defense and malleability and trying different things. What would you have done differently against Miami Heat and Jimmy Butler in the first round of the playoffs, right? It's an opportunity to kind of canvas a lot of very smart basketball people and get them, to provide some candid opinions of that, which you don't always necessarily get to do. So I think casting a wide net certainly has its value. I think we have discussed that there are constraints and expectations around this job in terms of expectations of not just contending, but literally, I think, Kane, we've discussed, I mean, it's championship or, I always hate to say championship or bust, right? But, Mike Budenholzer, for all of his perceived weaknesses, right, as a tactician, guy won a championship. Winning as head coach in the league over the last 5 years and won a championship. Mission accomplished in many respects, right? Now, obviously, we sit here and say, well, should he have won another championship at some point, right? Yeah, that would have been nice. They had opportunities to do that. And most importantly, and I think, this is something that Seth Partnow and Nate Duncan have the phrase that they've used, right? Fair ain't got nothing to do with it. It's not about fairness, right? It's not about, like, how good is your track record? Did you quote unquote deserve to get fired? Obviously, the estimation was that moving forward, Mike Budenholzer was not going to give the Bucks the best chance of winning an NBA championship. And now you have to figure out who is that guy to do that. And so it's been very interesting kind of seeing the names, because we've seen assistants, right? Kind of high flying young assistant types named, right? Charles Lee is obviously the first one that Bucks fans would think about, given that he's currently on the staff. But Chris Quinn from the Heat, Kevin Young from the Suns, Adrian Griffin from the Raptors, it's probably the most prominent ones. Kenny Atkinson, an assistant, but obviously a guy that has been a head coach and a former Bud protege, actually, now with the Warriors. And then you've got, essentially former head coaches that have been kind of bandied about, right? James Borrego, who was interviewed a few years ago before he took the Charlotte job. Mark Jackson, who's probably I think he probably inspired the most ire when his name was mentioned. I don't honestly know I don't honestly know what interviewing Mark Jackson necessarily gives you from a insight perspective, but maybe that was just a favor. I'm not surprised that if they interviewed Mark Jackson, it would get out, because Mark Jackson obviously still fancies himself a potential future NBA head coach. But and similarly Scott Brooks, right? Like, at least Scott Brooks is still an assistant. But is Scott Brooks going to be the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks? I'm gonna go ahead and say that's not going to happen. So anyway, I'm trying not to get too worked up about any names thrown around as potential interviewees. I think if like we saw last time, there's then a short list of kind of final round guys and potential gals, right? We haven't seen Becky Hammon mentioned, interestingly, even though she came back for multiple interviews in 2018. But with the group that's out there now, it's definitely a group that I think is, there's some interesting names in there, but I think the names that have sort of been talked about but haven't been officially linked to the job in terms of interviews is probably as interesting or more interesting. And I'm guessing we're going to see, as you mentioned, Nick Nurse. I don't know if Ty Lue's going to get out of that Clippers job, but Nick Nurse, Frank Vogel are probably the two guys that, most prominent. Like, why would you not interview those guys, right? Like, I think it would be eye-opening if those guys just didn't get interviewed at all. And again, yeah, Nick Nurse is owed some money. He can be selective. I'm not sure how much money Frank Vogel is still owed by the Lakers. Probably still some. Is Doc Rivers going to become available and get linked to this job? Again, I hope for the sake of all of us that read about this stuff on Twitter that he doesn't, because I don't think Doc Rivers is the answer. And I think the mental health of Bucks fans probably would not benefit from Doc Rivers being linked to this job. But yeah, it should be a big group. I would hope it's a big group. I think the one thing that is interesting though is as some very high profile guys have been let go, beginning with Bud, but now including Monty Williams, again, Doc Rivers. We're here on Monday night. Feels like Doc Rivers is probably going to be a name that becomes available, and the Sixers job will probably become open at some point this week. That would be my guess. If and when that happens, all of a sudden, you start to get some real competition from other jobs in terms of their appeal. And, maybe for the Bucks, you can't just take your time quite as much as you would have liked to. So we'll see. Bucks, John Horst said he was going to take his time and they were going to be very deliberate in the process. For what it's worth, Mike Budenholzer, I think, was hired on the 16th of May in 2018, but obviously they knew going into the offseason, right? It was no shock that they were going to be interviewing guys for the head coaching position, even though they, both that season as well as this season, they lost in the first round. So I don't know. Again, I'm not saying like Bucks are like behind schedule or something like that, because there was obviously a period post loss where, in part probably because of Bud's, the tragic situation with Bud's brother, like I think they were kind of just sort of letting things kind of sit for a bit and trying to find. I don't know if there's a good time to announce something like this, but anyway, so again, I would be surprised if it's June and we still don't have a Bucks head coach, but certainly it does seem like it doesn't seem like anything is imminent, and especially with some of the names that haven't been interviewed yet or haven't been discussed, that's kind of makes sense. But honestly, the only guy that I can think of that it wouldn't shock me if I heard in the next 24 or 48 hours that the Bucks were hiring would be Monty Williams, just from like a culture profile perspective. That's the only guy I could picture like just being named seemingly out of the blue as like, oh, this guy's going to be the new head coach of the Bucks. But even so, I think in an ideal world, the Bucks would probably like to take their time and actually go through this process and, again, do it at their own speed.
All right. Well, everyone just heard it. May 16 was Mike Budenholzer. It is. And Frank, we're in the same part of the world. It is May 15. Well, actually, that's a lie. It's May 16 where you are. It's May 15 where I am, which means that the Bucks might hire a head coach today. That's all I'm saying. So as you went through the process there, Frank, the one thing you didn't do was really outline if there's anyone in your mind that you're excited about, you perhaps have at the top of your list, or perhaps the opposite, if there's any people at the top of your list that, or at the bottom of your list, I guess, that you don't want that has been mentioned outside of the obvious names that I don't think we need to touch on that you might have already suggested early in your chat there. So we'll get to that next, but first we'll talk about the Game Time app. I already mentioned it tonight. It is very handy. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is fast and easy way to buy tickets for all sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you will have at the event. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code Locked On NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use the redeem code Locked On NBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So we went through the list, and you already mentioned Monty Williams. And by the way, if people missed the podcast yesterday, highly recommend go back and check it out. Gerald Bourget from PHNX Sports at least gave a little bit of an insight. And I spoke with Gerald after we did this podcast, and I did say to him, I feel like if Gerald asked me to do a podcast talking about Mike Budenholzer and what I think about him as a coach for the Phoenix Suns, I feel like I would have provided the same content. So I think for that reason that I totally understand why Bucks fans are hesitant towards Monty Williams, despite the fact that I think it would be a fine hire. And I think he's a guy that would come in. I think he's a good coach. I think it's hard to tell about his offensive prowess with X's and O's because he has coached Chris Paul in New Orleans and Phoenix. And I think that is a real factor. But if you go through all this list and look at really the marquee names is what we're talking about, but maybe there is an assistant that you're interested in. I think trying to judge assistant coaches is so difficult. Like when I see Kevin, I was about to say Steve Young. When I say Kevin Young, I'm like, I don't know. Like, how am I supposed to feel about that? And same with Chris Quinn, even though Chris Quinn is pretty highly regarded when you read things about what he can bring to the table. And he's been with Spoelstra, which I think is part of the appeal. Is there anyone you've got near the top of the pecking order, top of your list?
I mean, and let me preface this by saying, when we talk about like, who do I want as coach of the Milwaukee Bucks? We're doing this all off essentially vibes. Like, let's be honest, guys.
Of course.
I think anybody who feels like, they really know like that somebody would be great and others would be definitively bad. I mean, again, I think we all agree, like Mark Jackson, now we're not doing Mark Jackson. But I think the guys that I'm going to put it through the lens of who could I talk myself into being, either excited or like moderately happy as a Milwaukee Bucks next head coach. And by the way, I've got, I think we've got a pacifier situation again. For those of you that have babies, you guys probably appreciate you gotta sometimes, I popped out right again. The problem is these newborns.
Frank, this is going to be you, and this is perfect timing because this is about to be you if you don't get the coaching hire that you want. This is what people will be hearing on the pod.
Emma heard the name Mark Jackson and just immediately spit out her pacifier and was like, "I'm done with this." What kind of process is this? By the way, the other thing too is these newborns, they can't use their hands. They drop the pacifier, they can't pick it up, put it in their mouth. I mean, I'm not. There's a Thon Maker joke to be had here, Kane, which I'm not gonna make it.
All right.
But yes, baby hands, not a strong suit. I think the guys that I could talk myself into from a head coach standpoint, I think I would go with. I mean, Nurse is an obvious one. I think Nurse is the guy who I think is interesting because if you told me there's going to be a high profile candidate who doesn't even interview for this job because of some behind the scenes, there was bad vibes, there was background stuff that the Bucks didn't fit culture, Giannis for some reason doesn't like this guy. I would probably say that guy probably would be, and I would have said this 2 weeks ago when this all first started, Nurse is a really interesting guy. He's won an NBA championship. He's known for obviously being experimental, but he also, lost his job in Toronto. Didn't win a playoff series the last 3 years. Only made the playoffs once in the last 3 years. Had friction with players, assistants, front office, etc. For a front office that talks all the time about partnership and what they had with Bud. Again, as somebody who would love it if Nick Nurse aced the interviews and all the background came back great, and they're like, oh no, that the issues with Siakam and Gary Trent and whatever else, or this, who was the assistant that he had the issues with? It was the former Phoenix guy who was the head coach in Phoenix for a hot minute before Monty Williams.
Yeah.
So some of you listening to the podcast probably know who we're talking about, and I'm just blanking. I can pick Earl Campbell. No, not Earl Campbell. Earl
Watson.
Earl Watson. Not former Houston Oilers great Earl Campbell.
Well, I said Steve Young. So I mean, look, we are really locked on NFL.
It's you get a guy in a hotel and a guy with a baby in his room. You're not getting top quality stuff here. We apologize, but Nurse is so interesting because on the one hand, like there's that stuff that you're just like that stuff like doesn't feel very Bucksian, and I saw some people were even pulling up clips from actually Eric asked our friend Eric Name asked during the post game. Sorry, I think my internet just went out briefly. But post game of the 2020 All-Star game, when Nick Nurse was the coach of the team Giannis, and Giannis didn't really touch the ball late in the game, and I think Kyle Lowry and I don't know if Siakam was in too, but anyway, but it's like, people are like, oh, did like Giannis not like the fact that like he didn't get the ball from in this Nick Nurse coach game? Who knows, right? Did Pascal Siakam text his buddy Giannis and say like, fucking Nick Nurse, man, that guy sucks. Who knows, right? I mean, we don't know any of that, right? I think if Nick Nurse doesn't even get an interview, then clearly there was some background stuff going on that we're not aware of. But I think again, because Nurse tries shit and he's like kind of the anti-Bud, I think there's an obvious appeal to the idea of hire the guy who's different from the guy you had, and hopefully you can take the foundation of what you had, and then Nick Nurse can bring in some of that zigging when Bud would have zagged, and that can give them kind of a fresh viewpoint, and maybe he can be more of that tactician. The flip side, other than this kind of personal stuff, and by the way, the fact that he brings a guitar on road trips, that probably also is in the negative column for Nick Nurse. But interesting. I mean, he was known as an offensive guy as an assistant. Came up through the Rockets organization, with the Rio Grande Valley Vipers or whatever. They shot 1 billion threes, and was kind of thought of as this like mad scientist offensively. But that's been the area that the Raptors like sucked at, right? Like the half court offense. And so if you want to say like we want guys who can solve what the Bucks problems were, then I think you have to also say like Raptors half court offense was not like, a model of like innovation and like success the last couple of years. So, but all that said, I think again, any of these guys, whether it's Nurse or Ty Lue in particular, they've won championships, right? And there's something to be said for that. So I think Nick Nurse is the obvious guy that I think for many of us is like the most interesting guy. I would say Ty Lue is probably the one guy who I could see being above that. But I didn't even mention him when we first started talking because I was just like, is he really? Can you extract him from LA? And the podcast you did with our friends from the Locked On Clippers kind of hinted at like, there was obviously issues, and interesting. It seems like Tyronn Lue may be more interested in leaving than the Clippers may be in letting him leave at this point, or at least, the Clippers may be open to perhaps a compensated departure. But it may not be that easy. And again, even if he can be extracted, maybe it would be for Phoenix and not the Bucks. So Ty Lue, I think, is the safest guy, I feel like, in many ways. Like, he's won a championship. He's known as kind of a guy who's can get creative, try different things. I would point out Ty Lue has gone down in a lot of series. Like, think about 3-1 in the finals. Think about I got to sneeze here. That was loud. Think about going down, like losing the first 2 games against the Mavericks in like the first round, I think a couple years ago. Some Bud-like tendencies in terms of, his teams getting caught on their heels to start series and then making adjustments as the series wears on. Again, he's won a championship. He's had success, made the conference finals with a Clipper team that obviously was diminished through injuries a couple of years ago when they ultimately lost to the Suns. I think he's the easy kind of answer. But again, in terms of availability, I would kind of have the biggest concern. And so I think those 2 are probably like, I would say like atop my list of guys that I would feel most kind of comfortable with moving forward for different reasons. And then I think the other guys, again, I just really struggle with assistants at this point. I think Charles Lee, again, like Charles Lee could be a phenomenal coach. Maybe he would have done a lot of things differently than Mike Budenholzer. But, again, from the outside, I just have no way of judging that. Chris Quinn, again, could be a great head coach, but I have no idea, right? Like, is he going to have gravitas with Giannis and Drew and Chris? I have no idea, right? You'd hope so, right? Given those are good guys, and hopefully they'll respect any coach coming in. It's interesting. I was thinking about the other day. I mean, Spo's coaching tree is shockingly like limited, right? Like Fizdale and Juwan Howard going to Michigan are, from what I can gather when I was just asking people, like kind of the extent of who has sort of made it out of his coaching tree, which is interesting because like you compare it to a guy like Bud, who has been around, I think, very similar time in terms of being a head coach. And, Bud's coaching tree in terms of guys that were assistants with him and have gone to head jobs is much longer, including Darvin Ham. Shout out to Darvin Ham, by the way. The Lakers almost likable because of Darvin. And so that brings me probably to, when I talk about like guys who I could, kind of see the glass half full with. A former Bud assistant, Kenny Atkinson, I think is a guy that I also find really interesting. Has not won a championship, has really not had any NBA level success. I think he's won like 2 playoff games or something, but really turned around a Nets team that, was really struggling when he arrived, however long ago that was at this point. Actually made the Nets fun and interesting before, he got run out of town by, all right, we got the pacifier in again, guys.
I tell you what, this is honestly an incredible performance. I just want to put it out there. You've done some great podcasting things, but this is right up there.
This is going in the Locked On Bucks Hall of Fame, along with the post championship pod from the parking lot. She's making these funny noises. I don't know if you can hear this, but she's making these funny noises, and I think it's when she's like got a pacifier in her mouth, not that she's lost it, but we'll see. But Kenny Atkinson, again, kind of just known. I think a guy that, pedigree wise, good pedigree, and then goes to Golden State and has put in a couple of years with the Warriors. Obviously winning a championship last year as well. So again, he's kind of like in between, like, I don't call him a retread, but he has experience, but he's not really just like an assistant guy who's never been an NBA head coach. So I find Atkinson interesting. And then I think, honestly, I can still see, and I think a lot of people would disagree with me on this. I think I still see kind of the glass half full, or I can. I'm an optimist, I can still see the glass half full with Monty Williams. And I listened to your podcast with, with Gerald the earlier today. And I don't know. I don't take for granted the culture piece of this. Like, I don't. I know some people think like, that you could put, Rain Man on the bench for the Bucks and like the foundation with, like just some like tactical mastermind who, doesn't like to talk to people, and like, oh, the Bucks will be fine because, the core 4 are so functional or whatever. Like, I think I think there is still real value in having somebody that can manage personalities and, the modern NBA players. And I think that's one thing that Monty has shown he can do. And so, and of course, hey, he was in that locker room when the Bucks won an NBA championship. As some people saw, he came in and gave them sort of a congratulatory quick speech, which is still kind of funny. Like the Bucks trying to be serious while they're wearing like, ski goggles as they're trying to, pause while they're celebrating a championship. Those, you can debate whether he should have been in there or not, but he's obviously a stand-up guy, very likable guy. My friend of the pod, Ryan Connor, referred to him as having too much youth pastor energy, which I can definitely see. But I don't know. Obviously he has fallen short ultimately in the playoffs these last 2 years. There it is. Look at all the people trying it. Was that Vin Baker back there?
Giannis has got a dead serious look on his face, and he's got ski goggles on.
I don't think Giannis has worn ski goggles very much in his life. I'm gonna go ahead and put that out there. But I don't know. With Monty, I I think there's absolutely like the concern that you're basically hiring a guy who's basically like the worst version of Bud, in terms of being a guy that has really, builds a culture, foundation, and then, can't figure out how to get it done in the playoffs. Like totally valid criticism, right? I mean, like he's the guy that Bud beat in the playoffs for the NBA championship. But I don't know. I think he could come here and it could work, right? Certainly the regular season part. And again, with the playoff piece, like again, like everybody's going to point to Nick Nurse as like the X's and O's guru guy. But again, after Marc Gasol left, he hasn't won a playoff series in 3 years. Like, everybody fell all over themselves for the whole like switchable wing stuff, and it failed. Like, it didn't work. Like they missed the playoffs twice, and they got bounced in the first round the other year, right? And again, I think you can point a lot of that to honestly Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster, who never get any shit for anything, like who kind of have this halo because they constructed some really good rosters and they won an NBA championship in Toronto. So I get that those guys get a long leash, but it is sort of weird also just looking at that team and being like, why did you guys think you didn't need a center or like a backup point guard for like 2 or 3 years, right? Like this is kind of weird roster construction, and how much of that is, Nick Nurse not being able to coach talent versus just not being given like a functional roster. Like I think there's a very reasonable discussion that can be had around that. So yeah, I mean, I think again, like I think there's some quality candidates out there. I think the good news is like, we talked about it, like, I mean, hiring a coach who is as good in the abstract as Bud was not going to be easy. I think there's a number of candidates who are certainly like, close to, in certain situations, could be as good or better than Mike Budenholzer. And then I think the other obvious point, as we pointed out earlier, is this isn't just about like thinking about how good a coach Bud is in the abstract versus these guys in the abstract. It is about who is going to win more games starting in 2023, 2024 with the Milwaukee Bucks. And obviously there was a feeling that Bud, again, the message had gotten tired, players, including Giannis, must have been open to a new voice. And you have to hope that whoever out of this group is that voice, ultimately can bring that fresh perspective and, if not bring some sort of, revolutionary mad scientist, whatever, magic fairy dust in the playoffs, at least can get them into a better place mentally, which honestly, like a lot of, especially the Heat series just felt like a team that was not ready for it, right? Like we can talk about the X's and O's, but I think that was what was so sobering about that series. What it felt like the Bucks just sort of culturally and just sort of like emotionally just were not in the right space for that series. And that's, I think, something that you would not have expected of a Bud team. And obviously, again, have to point out like Bud going through what he was going through personally, starting Game 4 with his brother passing away. I mean, like, how could he have, been operating at the fullest of his capabilities? Like, I don't know how he could have, right? But Mike Budenholzer wasn't out there, dribbling, passing, and shooting in the fourth quarter the last 2 games. That was, to me, still largely, players that failed. And again, Bud made some huge tactical mistakes that hopefully a different coach wouldn't have made. But again, we'll see. So I don't know. I mean, again, so I'll say, the guys that give me the warm fuzzies, Nick Nurse, Ty Lue, probably in the first tier, Kenny Atkinson, maybe Monty in the second tier, and then kind of everybody else thereafter in varying tiers, let's say. And again, hard to compare, a Chris Quinn or even a Charles Lee to a guy with a known track record. But I don't know. Again, I just feel like the first step in doing all this is like acknowledging like that we're basing this off of, like indirect evidence in most cases.
Well, I knew I was flirting with danger when I just threw the open question with every single candidate on the list, and the list is this long, Frank. But ultimately, what you've said, I think, makes a lot of sense, and I do like, and I know I get a lot of crap for it, but the one thing is particularly when it comes to the assistant coaches, like, how do I even know what kind of coach Charles Lee is going to be? I don't know. I don't know. I can base the fact that he's been around Bud and he understands the culture and he's been around a winning team, that I think it would be a reasonable choice. plus you couple the fact that Darvin Ham's had success, Taylor Jenkins has had success, even though it's been a rocky road, that it gives you confidence that those guys would do well, which is maybe why people have some excitement about a Chris Quinn type candidate who has been around Eric Spoelstra, and I would assume has learned a whole lot from being around him. But it is, it's fascinating to see which way they're going to go down. You mentioned the millions of dollars that Mike Budenholzer is still going to be paid by the Bucks, and Monty Williams is in the same case. But if you want to win $1 million yourself, then just go to Prize Picks, because they've got a deal going on right now. The $1 million daily super flex promotion during the NBA playoffs and finals as well. Every day of the NBA playoffs and the finals, one Prize Picks user will win a chance at becoming a millionaire. One entry placed after 8 a.m. Eastern will be randomly selected each day. Whoever placed that entry will be given a 6-pick flex with the following payouts. If you get all 6 right, $1 million. 5, $80K, 4, $16K. Full details can be found at prizepicks.com/million. You must opt in at this link to be eligible for the $1 million entry. Once you opt in, all you have to do is play the game like normal. So 2 to 6 players over and under their Prize Picks projection, and you could be the lucky winner. So download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. Deposit $50, they'll give you $50. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. That's Prize Picks. So I've got one more burning question for you on this podcast, because this is something that I've thought about a lot, and I know in the future weeks we're going to get into the roster and what the Bucks can do. But clearly, every coaching decision is going to come down to Giannis. And I do wonder, and I've said this before on this show, I hope that the Bucks are feeling some pressure to do the right thing, make a solid decision. And obviously, they don't want to mess it up. But with Giannis with 2 years left on his contract, like ultimately, he's in his prime. Everyone wants him to stay around. So you can't really afford to mess this up. And I wonder whether that pressure on the franchise and understanding what a bad decision could mean is going to lean them to go with a safer option rather than some of the untried guys that we've potentially spoken about. Do you think about that and the ramifications of the Giannis situation at all when you consider who the Bucks might ultimately go with? And I guess when I talk about this, I'm talking about a Monty Williams type head coach who, again, to me, if you hire Monty Williams, it doesn't feel like that's going to be the type of hire that in 6 months you're like, wow, that was a disaster.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think the discussion of like what role Giannis in particular plays in this hire is an interesting one. I'm sure Giannis is aware of who is being interviewed. I think if Giannis had thoughts, right? Like if for some reason Giannis had some, veto that he felt like he desperately wanted of like, I don't want this guy for whatever reason, clearly that would impact the Bucks thinking. I'll say this as well. I think, and you touched on it, I think in one of the previous pods, I think if you're interested in the Bucks continuing to invest to the level that they need to in terms of paying to keep players and building around Giannis to the best of their abilities, I feel like Giannis, first of all, I don't think Giannis really has a whole lot of incentive to sign an extension later this year when he's eligible to sign. And again, he'll have 2+1 left on his current contract, so it's not like it's as imminent as it was a couple of years back where he was entering the final year of his contract. And so I think especially, just given where he is in his career and the timeline of this team, I wouldn't sign it if I'm Giannis, right? Like, I mean, unless he suffers a career-ending injury, even if he tears his ACL, tears his Achilles, like someone's going to give him a max. Like it's not like it's going to be a problem for him to get a max contract whenever his deal is up, no matter kind of like where he is. So to me, like not signing the contract is a way to sort of keep the Bucks honest and basically say like, hey guys, as long as we're competing for championships and you guys want me around,
that's right. Exactly.
I'm going to be happy to stay. Right.
Absolutely.
I think if he just signs in the bottom line and just perpetually like, takes the money, I think he loses some of that. And again, it's not to say like if he ever decided to then, ask for a trade, the Bucks would be like, haha, nope, you're under contract. We're not going to trade you. I don't think the Bucks would ever want to trade Giannis in a scenario like that, but what he wants will always have leverage. So I'll say this: I don't think Giannis has an incentive to sign a new contract this fall. I don't think he will. I don't think people need to freak out about it because there's not really much financial or practical incentive for him to do that. Looks like I got to deal with the pacifier here in a minute. But I think absolutely, like, we saw it with Bud. He had to kind of interview with Chris and Giannis before he got the final, thumbs up to sign his contract. I think whoever becomes the head coach of the Bucks, I think is going to talk to Giannis at a minimum before he ultimately signs that contract. So I didn't even mention Mark Jackson, and this baby is like losing her pacifier and going crazy. Maybe she's just upset at the mere suggestion that Giannis might not sign that contract extension this fall.
It's all connected.
Let me ask you this, Kane, before we drop off. I know we're running along in this pod, but
yeah,
I mean, you heard my general sort of like, emotional like reaction meter to some of these candidates. I mean, who stands out to you? I mean, who do you feel like, hey, I would be excited as a Bucks fan for these guys? Maybe some guys you wouldn't be, or like where kind of is your head at with all these things? Again, I think you're probably similar to me in terms of not trying to, have a false sense of precision about how good these guys would be, but kind of where are you at with, again, the vibes check of all this?
If I had to pick literally one candidate and put him at the top of the pile, him or her at the top of the pile, then I would put Ty Lue for a couple of reasons. That, first of all, he's been around multiple superstars, and the superstars always generally seem to get along with Ty Lue, which I think is important. Like that's clearly a factor in the decision. He won a title in Cleveland, which was obviously miraculous the way that went down. But I think perhaps more impressively is what he's been able to do with these Clippers teams. And I think mostly offensively, that they've always been able to, he seems to have been able to get the best out of the Clippers role players offensively when inevitably their superstars haven't been able to stay on the court. So I think he's been impressive. And even before he got a head coaching job, he was definitely highly touted for his basketball brain, certainly as a player, but then as an assistant coach coming through the ranks. So if it would be pure excitement levels of a head coach they could sign, like if they sign Ty Lue, I'll talk myself into that being an absolute home run as soon as they do it. Nick Nurse, I'd be very interested in, but I think that there's clearly, I don't think that's an absolute home run. Like I think that there's clearly some reason for pause, whether it's relationships with people he's worked with, which I think matters, because when we talk about what are the Bucks going to do, and is this going to be something where everyone's going to be happy, the Bucks have had zero drama for the last 5 years. And I don't think that you can completely walk into a Nick Nurse situation and go, okay, well, everyone's going to be happy, because I could absolutely see in 6 months that people are annoyed with different situations. You hear some things that he might be difficult to work with. So that would be the pause with Nick Nurse, even though the innovation and his ability to just like, hey, let's just try stuff is very exciting. So I understand why Bucks fans are excited about Nick Nurse. And then after that, I don't know, there'd be the safe hires. Like I think Monty Williams would be good. I think Kenny Atkinson would be a fine hire and a safe hire again from the culture perspective. But just for pure, like, would I be excited about the hire? I think Ty Lue is at the top of the list. But that's always been why I don't understand why the Clippers want to get rid of him. But doing that podcast with Darian from Locked On Clippers, I was like, okay, this seems like there's enough drama here that he might want to go to a safe situation in Milwaukee and have Giannis, who, knock on wood, to this point has been pretty reliable from a health standpoint as well. Like I can understand why Ty Lue would be like, I don't want to do another regular season and get to the postseason where Kawhi Leonard's injured again. So that's the hope. So that's kind of where I sit, which, as you pointed to, I think we're kind of similar.
Yeah, I think, honestly, the only coach in the league at this point that doesn't have something that their fan base would really, like, has really kind of gotten aggravated about, and like, there isn't some portion of the fan base that like thinks the coach is like a real problem, is Spo, honestly. Like, is there really anybody else? Because like Steve Kerr, like, I mean, that fan base is like had lots of questions about like the rotations and the fact that they haven't been able to figure out what to do with these young
So
guys.
let me just ask you
and
this
stuff like
quickly.
that.
So Steve Kerr, you're not seeing him.
Coming
Well, I'm just.
available? No.
Well, I don't think so. But it at least, like, as you said, the fans are obviously impatient, and they've been obviously very spoiled over the last decade. But they're impatient as sports fans are. But there's been more than a few comments on YouTube where Bucks fans are like, "Do you think there's any chance?" I don't really see it.
I don't really see it either. I think if Steve Kerr like left Golden State, I mean, I don't think Steve Kerr's going to like coach there forever. I mean, let's be clear. Like, I don't think he's going to be Spo, where he's just like a 20-year institution type guy. I don't think he's going to be Pop. I think Spo is the only guy that I can look at and see as like being like a Pop type guy that just is an institution and just like becomes bigger than any player, which is interesting because Spo kind of struggled with that early in his career. I mean, like, I remember like his first year, he almost like got pushed out by LeBron, and Riley had to basically have his back. I mean, the other interesting thing with Spo is, I mean, he really hasn't had a championship level roster since LeBron left. So there really also hasn't been expectation of winning a championship since LeBron left Miami. So he's kind of like, been just sort of like a, maximizer type coach. And again, I don't have any doubts that he could win a championship with, superstar talents or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think this is the nature of the league now. I mean, there's been a lot of commentary about, kind of how unforgiving this business is. And I think that's just the reality of, situations where you have players making 40 to $50 million and coaches who make 7 or 8, and how hard it is to just manage a personality, the personalities, and kind of turn the right button or turn the right dials and push the right buttons in the playoffs when everything is so scrutinized, right? Like, like 20, 30 years ago, Kane, I mean, when you first started watching, the NBA, like, player, coaching adjustments and, play styles and all that stuff. Like, again, like, obviously teams were aware of that stuff, but like the media and stuff like that, like, there was not nearly, I think, the same level of scrutiny. And I think the other piece too is, I mean, the parity that we've seen these last few years, even with the Warriors having their big run sort of at the end of the last decade, since then, I mean, Toronto wins a championship, the Bucks win a championship. Obviously, we saw Golden State win a championship as well. I mean, the Lakers won a championship, right? So, well, the Lakers, right? But
Denver.
I mean, Denver has a chance to win it. I mean, like, it hasn't been wide open, but the last couple of years, like, we've seen teams be able to break through, and I think that means that there's expectations across the league that are higher than they were certainly during the LeBron, Cavs, KD/Steph Warriors during that kind of whatever it was 3-year spell. At that point it was kind of like, well, those are just the teams that are going to be in the finals every year, right? Like, if you couldn't coach to the finals, it's like, well, yeah, like that's just the expectation. But now it's like, all these teams have really elevated expectations, and we've seen teams go all in with huge trades, and the dollars are enormous. And so I get it, right? Like, like what we talked about when Bud was fired, like, easier to fire the coach than the players. And so I think it's just the nature of this game. It honestly reminds me a lot more of like European soccer, where there's just like, guys win championship, like league titles, and then are fired, right? Because they didn't win the Champions League or something, or whatever it might be, right? With these really high level clubs, guys don't stick around long. Guys stick around like 2-3 years max, it feels like, even when they have some success. And then sure enough, then they're gone. So it feels like that's kind of just where the NBA has landed. And player movement, player empowerment, and just an increased focus on all this stuff. I think this is just the natural sort of outcome of that. So is that good for the sport? I don't know. But on the bright side, for if you're an NBA head coach, hey, you know what? Lots of NBA head coaches getting paid money to not do anything because they get fired and they have all this money coming their way in the years that they're not going to be employed. So anyway, we'll see. I'm sure we will have probably more podcasts about the Milwaukee Bucks coaching search, and I hope we'll hear some of these names that we have mentioned that have not actually been formally interviewed get interviewed. But who knows? Maybe a move will be made before then.
All right. Well, this has been one of our longer ones for a while. And Frank, don't think that I don't understand that you're going to be up all night. So you're just trying to drag me into doing a 24-hour podcast. But that's not the way we operate. We're on the same time zone, which means that it's not 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I need to get some damn sleep. So I'm calling it. But we will have a podcast tomorrow and continue to roll through the week. I'm actually catching up with Sean Woodley from Locked On Raptors because we are going to talk about Nick Nurse because we can speculate about all these things. But I found it fascinating to watch the Toronto Raptors and the reaction to Nick Nurse and how it's changed over the last few years. So I want to ask some questions of Sean about how the Raptors fan base has sort of taken in the last few years of Nick Nurse from the title in 2019 to obviously where they are now. So we're going to do that. So make sure you check out that podcast later in the week. Subscribe, drop a like, a comment, follow, all those things. It's free to do. And it helps us, and we really appreciate it. And as you've been doing for the last week or so, continue to let us know what you think about the head coaching candidates and even the new ones, because every time we do a new podcast, there is another couple of names that have been thrown in the hat, and there probably will be by the time you're listening to this. So make sure you do that. Frank, look after yourself tonight, please. Get an hour or two, please, for goodness sake.
I mean, I would love to get some sleep tonight, but I've got a 6-day-old kid over here that may feel otherwise.
Yeah, well, she's probably still more mature than me, so that's the way these things operate. But no, congratulations to you, Frank. By the way, you had a bit going on last week, so I don't know if you heard the public congratulations, but we're pumped. We're pumped for you, and the good news is that I know you're still going to be here podcasting with us on Locked On Bucks. So as I said, we'll be back tomorrow. Let us know what you thought about this show. And we'll speak to you all tomorrow.